I'd like to welcome everybody to our 2020 MAIZEX Seeds Western Canada Agronomy webinar. My name is Steve Denise and I'm the brand director with MAIZEX Seeds. We've got a good agenda for you here today. I'm going to give you a brief update on MAIZEX Seeds, but the heart of our lineup today is Greg Stewart, lead agronomist with MAIZEX Seeds, who's going to be talking about more management, more corn. John Heard is joining us from Manitoba Agriculture to talk about the top 7 fertility considerations for corn. John Fox with North Valley Precision Planting is going to focus on planter setup to maximize crop uniformity and yield. And Jarret Geisel, territory manager with MAIZEX Seeds, is going to focus on the right product for the right field. These agronomy days and our webinars are really part of an overall objective, which is to provide our customers with value-added agronomy information to aid in your decision making, and at the end of the day, increase your on-farm profitability. Our company goal as a whole is really, and we see our path to success, is to focus on our customers' needs field by field as a Canada-focused and a Canadian-owned seed business. So our focus is on this country, and you'll see that by the investment that we're making here over the next couple of minutes. How are we going to get there in terms of supporting our customers' needs? Well, the first thing we're doing is we're investing in production and processing capacity to meet the growth potential that we see into the future, with a real focus on not only quality production in the field, but also in the bag. We're investing in product development to be the best in class for product performance and maturities in regions right across the country. We are investing in our agronomy support to help growers achieve their yield goals, which is part of this webinar today, is to service that purpose. And we're investing in our team. So I'm going to just take a quick couple of minutes to talk about that. Over the last year, just to bring everybody up to speed, we completed the merger of the elite corn and soybean business into MAIZEX Seeds as part of our joint venture with Solio Agriculture. And what this did is we gave us a tremendous opportunity to look at the business across the country, the joint venture business as a whole. So what we first did is we've combined and expanded our product line. So we took what was the best of both companies' product lines in corn and soybeans, and we've enhanced that product line in terms of our introductions for 2020. We've expanded our team by region to service our customers across the country, and we've invested in expanded Canadian production to meet our needs into the future. On the left-hand side, you'll see a picture of our home processing facility in Tilbury, Ontario, which includes our head office. And this past year, we invested and purchased the former Corteva production facility in Blenheim, Ontario. This allowed us basically to double our capacity to meet the needs that we see not only with our current business. When we look at our product lineup and our growth in different parts of the market across Canada, it's going to allow us to meet those needs going forward. We're actually very blessed in the region that we are in for seed corn production. Pretty much all the seed corn that is produced in Canada is produced in southwestern Ontario, which is where our 2 locations are located. For those of you outside of Ontario, to get a basis here in terms of where our production facilities are located and our production fields, we're essentially on a line, if you go across the U.S., a line that's parallel with northern Iowa and with northern California. We're very blessed to have a climate that's moderated by the Great Lakes, and this gives us very predictable and good seed corn production year after year with a long frost-free period. We're investing in the future of our corn testing and breeding program. MAIZEX Seeds now has one of the largest and most intensive pre-commercial development and testing programs in Canada. And we've got locations right across the country in all the maturity zones, which gives us the opportunity to evaluate products for commercialization based on yield, agronomic traits, and other factors that we need to look at for what our customers' needs are. We're doing this by looking at not only grain hybrids, but also silage hybrids, and as well grazing corn hybrids when we look at some of the market potential in Western Canada. And we really see excellent future potential in terms of our product lineup through this program. We're doing the same thing on soybeans in terms of our extensive pre-commercial testing and breeding program. And there we're focusing not only on yield, but agronomic traits, including disease tolerance. And we're also building a trait portfolio in soybeans, especially in herbicide tolerance, as we look to the future. And again, we see some excellent potential there. Last year, really, we had weather uncertainty right across Canada. And so when we have these agronomy meetings and these webinars, really it's to give you some strategies to deal with that as well. Outside of what we're facing from the weather perspective, we've also seen uncertainty in the markets, and certainly China comes to mind, most of mind when we look at some of the impacts from this past year. As we look at 2020 now, we've got the some of the regular uncertainties in terms of what the weather is going to bring us in terms of the production season for 2020. But also going into the season, we've got the global uncertainty tied to the COVID-19. And this is really unprecedented, and really we're living history right now, and a lot of people I talk to feel like they're living in a movie. But this is having an impact on our families and our day-to-day life. It's going to have an impact on the economy and in terms of organizing for planning 2020. But we've really worked with our team to get our product in place so that we're in a good position to support our customers right across the country. In terms of COVID-19, we really recommend to our customers, and this is an additional to our webinar that we've added since we actually taped the webinar, but we're asking you to follow public health recommendations first and foremost, and take all of the recommendations seriously, not only to protect your family, but to protect those that you may know who have a compromised immune system. And the goal here is, if we can keep that curve low, is not to overload our healthcare system. And that has been taught to us really by some of the experience around the world. We're fortunate in that agriculture is deemed an essential industry. Having a safe and predictable and delivered on a regular basis food supply is absolutely critical for our population. And in terms of our role in that, MAIZEX is in an excellent position this spring to support the spring needs of our customers right across the country. Like every business, we're following protocols at our facilities, and we've asked our team to follow protocols in the field, and that includes really strict hygiene and sanitation protocols. At our plants these days, we've got no visitors until this high-risk period is over. We've got protocols for truck drivers in terms of when they're entering and leaving the plant. We've really scaled things down to essential staff in our offices, with many of our people working from home. And then we have strategies in place with our sales teams and with our dealer network to ensure that we reduce the risk to you, our customer, and your families as we deliver and support your seed needs for this spring on seed corn and seed soybeans. All right, with that, we're going to turn it over to Greg Stewart, who's our first speaker, and Greg is going to talk about more management, more corn.
The last few years, I've been out to Manitoba a few times and to Alberta, and it's still this underlying favorite theme: how do you generate more yield? And from a crop uniformity perspective, do you get it from spacing, that is sort of the picket fence stand approach, or do you get it from uniform timing, that is timing of emergence or good early growth? It really shouldn't be an either or option, but I think the clear message that has come out, as I've personally worked on this for 20 years or so, is that spacing is nice. We love a picket fence spacing, but what really drives yields much more than spacing is uniformity in the plant stand, starting with emergence and early growth, so that each plant is virtually identical to the plant beside it. So when we consider that in fields that we've looked at over the years, we get two rather interesting observations that keep coming back at us. And I've identified that on just a picture from some work I did here in this field, where we went out and for looking at ear size, ear count, positioning them on a board. You quite often are surprised in the fall, and this has been going on for years now, that you'll see ears that look like they have pretty reasonable spacing and yet are about a half of what they should be. And then you'll see, again, quite often, spacing that is not perfect, and yet you see ears that look like they're very competitive, even though they are, verging on being 2 inches apart or in that double sort of frame. And so over the years, this has been intriguing. We've done lots of research. I won't throw too many numbers at you today, but just the overlying principle is that we must get the plants to be very uniform in terms of emergence and in terms of their competitive nature beside each other. If we look at this next shot, you'll see, again, 2 corn stalks that you would not be necessarily happy about the spacing. They look to be crowded there. And you see one of the ears considerably short on good pollination and kernel set. I promise you that smaller stalk and the virtually barren ear is much more a result of that plant not getting off to a good start timing-wise, emergence-wise, early growth-wise, than it is because it looks like it's a little tight to its neighbor, right? And so as we move along in this discussion, we continue to look for opportunities to improve uniformity in the stand. I will throw out from our 2019 Ontario Yield Tour. So we stomp around in Ontario over 350, 400 fields, and of course we do evaluations of what we think the yield's going to be, and that obviously starts with an ear count, not a stand count, not necessarily counting the plants, but counting the ears. And this past year, our average ear count in the 2019 Yield Tour came in at 29,800 ears per acre. So essentially we're saying that over half the fields in our trials, well, these aren't trials, these are just farmers' fields that we survey, over half the fields didn't make it to a 30,000 ears per acre count. And in some cases, that isn't because there isn't a plant there, it's because it doesn't generate a solid ear. And so that's a real, I think, a wake-up call for most growers, is not just to think, oh, well, I set the planter at 34,000, looked like the stand was pretty good there. The mandatory evaluation that must happen if you're going to make progress on corn yield is to see what your ear count looks like at the end of the season. And many of our growers are surprised when we come back and say, well, you had 28.5 solid ears per acre, and they go, well, that's impossible. And then you start looking around and you start learning things about how uniform your seed bed is, how well your planter's working. So a little bit of quick yield math. If you were 30,000 ears at 16 rows around and 34 kernels deep on an ear, and let's say it takes 95,000 kernels to make a bushel, that'd be about a 172. If through some practices you could move that ear count from 30,000 to 32,000, and again we would I think safely assume that you could stay with the same ear size, 16, 34, and 95,000 kernels to make a bushel, you'd be 11 bushels up if you could just make those adjustments that would give you a relatively modest improvement of 2,000 ears per acre. 11 bushels of grain, that'd be somewhere between 1.5 tons and 2 tons of silage. So one of the things that we've been really intrigued by at MAIZEX is planting depth. You would think after 35 years of working in this game, we would have sorted out planting depth so there'd be no questions left to ask. I guess the blunt answer to that question is it doesn't appear that we have it as figured out as we thought we should. Our simple question was, can you produce more uniform stands simply by planting deeper than the traditional 1.5 to 2 inches deep? And I'll show you what what we're talking about on this deeper planting, the impact of planting depth on corn emergence, and I want you to think about it as this emergence window. If you've heard some of the hotshot corn growers that are in the high yield contest games, they talk about having all of their plants up within this very tight time frame. I refer to that as the emergence window. How narrow can you make the emergence window? Can you get all of your plants to come up within, a 2 or 3 day window instead of a 4 or 5 or 6 day window? We're pretty convinced that whatever you can do to narrow that emergence window generally results in better yield. So what we've noticed that in some of our shallower planting projects, obviously in this graph, I'm showing plants coming up on day 1. Essentially, that's the first day that we see any emergence. and it almost always obviously comes from those that were planted shallower, in this case at 1.5 inches. And then you track that emergence over the next 5 days, and you see that essentially you get to sort of your maximum emergence at sort of day 5 in this particular study. We compare that to planting deeper, and in this case it was close to 3 inches. So there are no plants up on the day 1 where you see plants on the shallow planted. You may not even see many plants on the day 2. You'd have maybe a 2-day delay in emergence. But then when they start emerging on the deeper depths, you get this bigger flush of emergence, and you therefore narrow that emergence window. We think that's pretty solid in terms of the theory. Whatever you can do to narrow the emergence window is a good thing. In these Ontario situations, it's often been by planting a bit on the deeper side. So if I show you the Ontario results, in 2018, 8 out of 11 sites showed a positive yield response to being on the deeper side. When we say deeper, we're generally comparing 2 versus 3-inch planting depths. 2019, 23 out of the 26 sites showed a positive response to planting a bit deeper. On average, the improvement is about 4 bushels per acre, so not huge, but 4 bushels you might as well have if it costs you nothing, but just taking a little more time to make sure the planting depth is good for your location and field. So we of course started this work in earnest in Manitoba in 2019. So on this screen you can see the sites that we're working at in Manitoba. We generally set the planting depths at 1.75 versus 2.75. We have this thing called forced uniformity, where essentially we cut the plants at ground level at the 2-leaf stage. This is sort of a crazy concept that I've been playing with, is if you went back out to the stand and actually cut them off at the surface at about the 2-3 leaf tip stage, could you force that stand to be more uniform and therefore higher yielding? Well, you'll see the results in a minute from our Manitoba trials. 4 replications and done across 3 of our key hybrids. So here is the less than exciting results from our first year of some of this planting depth forced uniformity work in Manitoba. These averaged across the sites. We actually gave up a bit of yield when we went from 1 3/4 to 2 3/4 planting. And you'll also notice that when we cut the plants off and tried to force them to be more uniform, we didn't get any positive response from that approach. We had some sites in Ontario that also didn't show us a very positive response to our somewhat lunatic idea of forcing them to be more uniform, although we have some sites where it did appear to work. So we're certainly not done with this sort of testing in Manitoba. It would certainly be realistic that both Jarret and I and others in the Maizex world had sort of been warned by Manitoba growers that they didn't think there was much advantage under Manitoba conditions to try to push the planting depth deeper. We acknowledge that as a good observation, and we'll continue to examine just where uniformity can come from in terms of planting depth. Our general consensus is that planting on the shallow side, missing planting depth on the shallow side is generally much riskier than missing a little bit on the deeper side. And then I won't belabor the forced uniformity idea, but essentially that's our protocol there. In Ontario, we actually sprayed them with UAN to try to burn them off, to essentially ask them to reset. And we also did cutting them with scissors. Again, it's just our way of sort of investigating this idea of how critical it is to get the plant off to a dead, uniform start. I think we have some homework to still do there. I do have growers in Ontario that I've worked with, where we are convinced now that if for whatever reason we had a very ugly start, whether it was too shallow or no rain, and we had a very unacceptable level of uniformity, that burning them off with a flat fan spray of 28 at sort of the 2-leaf stage wouldn't be the most crazy thing you've ever tried. I'm going to pause there unless anyone has a question about this whole planting depth stuff.
Any questions for Greg?
That's okay. We'll keep on trucking, and maybe we can pause at the end. So I won't get into too much on the equipment side, but this has been an observation. When we moved into vertical tillage tools in Ontario in a big way, one of the principal advantages of vertical tillage tools compared to a disc, or in some cases even to field cultivators, was just an enhanced attention to harrows, rolling baskets, leveling bars, to create a more uniform environment for the plant to run in. I think that's worthy of our consideration in trying to improve uniformity, is how level an environment are you giving the planter to work in. I will just spend a second on tire inflation. Again, my days with the government and over the last few years, lots of attention in Ontario on compaction, axle loading, what speed you're traveling at, knowing your tire specs, and getting the inflation pressure correct to try to reduce the stresses in the seed bed. This is a setup from one of our instrumented sites that the Ontario government did. Essentially, this tractor should be at about 9 psi in those dual tire configurations. We drive it over the sensors, and in this case, the surface sensor, that is a sensor at 6 inches deep, that's the green lines, measures the pressure in the soil surface, and there was 9 psi in the tire. We measure about 8 psi at the shallow sensor, and this is old news in terms of that your ground pressure is very closely connected to the inflation pressure in the tires. But I'll just make the comment that in these big events that we've been running, or that the government and innovative farmers and other associations have been running in Ontario, and you bring in 50 good growers with 50 different sets of combines, grain buggies, tractors, planters, et cetera, and then you bring them all up onto scales, you weigh the axles, you check the tire specs, you assess the inflation pressure, and you bring the inflation pressures in line to the load, the speed, and what the tire can handle. It's really quite eye-opening how many pieces of equipment come in completely off on inflation pressure. I mean, double what they need, inside duals being way off from outside duals, front tires being incorrectly inflated relative to what they could handle. Just a real eye-opening experience when you start looking at what sort of compaction stress we are applying to soils and how much more we need to care about getting the load, the speed, the tire specs, and the inflation pressure all lined up to try to minimize soil compaction, particularly at the surface. So my comment, and I'm sure John Fox will have other stuff to say about this, but essentially my comment is spend your first dollar on trying to achieve uniform emergence and even early growth. In my opinion, it is the critical piece to still chase, is how do you get all your plants up in 2 or 3 days. I'd love to have perfect spacing too if I could get it, but you should never spend money chasing spacing until you've got emergence and early growth working well on your fields. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of our intensive management work. In Ontario and across the Corn Belt, we are intrigued by intensive management and what it's doing to yields. There is sort of this interesting development of higher test weights, heavier kernels that are coming from fungicide applications, they're coming from genetic improvement, and they're coming from increased leaf end concentration. I won't spend too long talking about this other than to throw it out at you as something to consider in terms of the next wave of improvement in corn yield is this higher kernel weight that's coming from this connection, at least in the most of the Corn Belt, from better plant health that's driving much heavier kernels than we're used to. And so in our work, that leaves us to consider, from an intensive management perspective, 3 key factors: population, nitrogen, and fungicide. Now, we've done lots of this work in the East. Only this year have we really been able to move to the West, particularly into our Manitoba sites, to try to evaluate population, nitrogen, and fungicide, and this whole synergy into intensive management. So, an intensive management site, we need to look at multiple hybrids, and we need to compare intensive versus standard management. I'm just going to talk about some of the quick results that came from Manitoba this year, mostly as a result of Jarret Geisel willing to do all the plot work essentially on his back. So if we talk first just quickly about populations, our populations trial in Manitoba, 28, 32, 36, 40,000 plants per acre, replicated 4 times. I've got locations in this data set from Winkler and Elm Creek, and of course we need to run multiple hybrids to evaluate what that looks like across a range of hybrid possibilities. If I look at all 5 hybrids together, there's our population trends, relatively flat if you were to just group all the hybrids together. If I look at 1340 by itself, we see more of a response to push populations a little towards the top end. If I compare that to 44H12, wow, pretty flat. Whether you're at 28,000 or 40,000, that hybrid does not seem to move. Of course, that's some of the key information that we have to provide growers is this a hybrid that really should be pushed into the 34, 35 range, or is it a hybrid that could live quite happily at 30,000? I know John Herd's going to talk about fertility stuff and probably some nitrogen stuff, so I won't spend much time on it, but just to say that in this intensive management protocol, we look at essentially this year, we look at putting 140 pounds down up front across all of the plots. Then we add 50 pounds extra right at timing, right at planting, a top up 50 pounds later, let's call it V3, and then again compare that to a top up 50 pounds later at V8. Just our top ups all done with UAN applied in sort of a Y drop fashion. This is where Jarret comes into play with the backpack being able to deliver the Y drop 50 pounds of N right beside the corn rows at different stages. Our results from this year are on this site, on this screen. So some modest improvements for the 50 pounds of nitrogen, barely economical, and it didn't seem to matter too much whether it went on early or whether it went on June 10th or July 10th. If we now try to bring the whole picture together, where we would talk about intensive management, again, those are the sites we're talking about: Winkler and Elm Creek, 4 reps, a range of hybrids that we're looking at. And now I'm just going to focus in on 2 particular treatments. Our intensive treatment, which would be moving all 3 factors at once. That is 38,000 population, 220 pounds of nitrogen, and a fungicide application, and then compare that to our standard treatment, which would be 32,000 plants per acre, 160 pounds of N, and no fungicide. And then just want to look at our range of hybrids to see, are they workhorses? Are they racehorses? Do they respond to the extra inputs of population, nitrogen, and fungicide? And do they respond with enough to make it pay? So again, averaged over all sites. Here's 4 key hybrids for us, and they're essentially their response. The green bar would be our standard management, 32,000, 160 pounds of nitrogen, and no fungicide application. And the blue bar is our intensive approach, up the population, up the nitrogen by 50 pounds, and spray it at tassel time with a fungicide, in this case, Moravis Neal. So obviously, we're interested in what the net results are from intensive management, but probably from a seed company perspective, we're more interested in being able to talk about individual hybrids and whether they are responsive or not. So I mentioned 44H12 that didn't seem to respond to population, doesn't also seem to respond to nitrogen or the fungicide package, even when you put them all together. You compare that to something like 1340, where we compare our standard treatment at 171, up the population, up the nitrogen, up the fungicide, and we move to 189. You're probably asking the question, well, how many bushels does it take you to actually pay for 5,000 seeds, 50 pounds of nitrogen, and a fungicide application? And the answer is about 15. So you'd need a 15 bushel response between the light green bar and the blue bar to make it pay. 1340 actually seems like, again, based on 1 year of trialing and 2 sites, that it is a hybrid that seems to respond more to intense management compared to some of the other ones here, like I mentioned, who seemed fairly flat in their response. At the end of the day, that's what we're after, being able to give good recommendations as to whether it's a hybrid that has sort of more of a racehorse tendency that would respond to additional inputs, or whether perhaps it's a hybrid that is not going to respond to the extra push. So I'm just about out of time here. Just a quick reminder section here on things that are important as we move forward. Can't emphasize enough, if we're going to make improvements in corn yields, and this works really whether we're talking grain or silage, is what's your ear count. Absolutely critical piece of information to have for growers is to get out there and say with some confidence what their ear count is like at the end of the season. We need to maximize plant-to-plant uniformity in emergence and early growth. Planting depth, well, we think in the East that our key recommendation is to plant a little bit deeper. Clearly, that didn't seem to apply in Manitoba, so we're quite intrigued to go back out there again this year and evaluate planting depth under sort of Western Canadian conditions to make sure we've got our story straight there. Population, again, still a critical factor for shorter season hybrids like we're growing in Western Canada to get the correct population for the hybrid. And you're really going to get that from some of our population studies, but then also balancing it against where did you end up in your fields by doing an ear count check. And then on the intensive management, this is new in the West in terms of pushing hybrids, especially with a fungicide. So we're still excited to sort out the correct approaches for these shorter season areas, shorter season hybrids, being able to identify hybrids that are more responsive to the intensive package and particularly responsive enough to make it an economic advantage if you put the extra inputs into it. Most of this stuff that I've talked about in terms of the plots that Jarret did in Manitoba are in this document called our 2019 Agronomy Summary Western Edition. If you go to the MAIZEX website and click on this blog here, on this URL, I should say, you can download that whole document. And maybe, Steve, there's a minute or two for a question if someone has one that's burning.
Very good. Thank you, Greg. Anybody have a question for Greg? You must have covered it off well, Greg.
Yeah, that's the risk.
So, with that, and Greg will be available. He'll be on the call the rest of the way if there's any questions as we wrap up. We'll switch gears now, and John Heard with Manitoba Agriculture. John, I'm going to make you the presenter. And John is going to focus his time on the top 7 fertility considerations for corn.
Okay, sorry for the hold up there, but that's normal for me and technology. So thanks for the chance to run over some of these ideas that I've gleaned from a couple sources, and just really reminders for this next growing season here. Okay, so I'll make up some time here. We're going to go over some nitrogen rates, our in-season nitrogen splitting studies, about how prairie farmers can side dress P and K, our phosphorus recommendations to rebuild depleted soils, talk about K deficiencies, zinc and sulfur needs. So oh boy, that's bad. Anyways, I don't know why that's not floating in the way I wanted it to.
Oh, go to your presentation.
Go to
John.
Try go to slideshow. You're not on slideshow, John.
Yeah. Go over 2 more. To the far right. Keep going.
Okay.
Or down there, we'll do it too.
Yeah. Go to the bottom. Straight down. There you go.
Okay. Now the float. Well, we'll skip that one. Let's look at what the fertilizer rates are that farmers currently use in Manitoba, and these are the rates according to what farmers tell people on crop insurance. And so standard or average rates across the province are about that 125 to 130 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 30 to 50 pounds of phosphorus. There's only a few farmers in that northwest portion, but I'm glad to see that they're serious about their phosphorus levels, as they are about their potash levels. Those few people growing corn in the northwest will be growing them on sandy soils. But in general, some of our K levels are fairly modest for corn crops. And then we can see that there is some sulfur applications. That's not for all crops, but we hope that those are getting it, especially if we've dropped canola out of the rotation. So next slide is on, there's some Stratus ag research surveys been done in the province of growers to decide how is it that they decide on what they choose for their fertilizer rate in corn. We can see the top response is that farmers soil test. Second most popular response is that they calculate based on nutrient balance. Nutrient balance doesn't make much sense to me for nitrogen, but I presume that means they're looking at a yield goal and then figuring it's taking 1 to 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. And then the third most common response is based on their past experience. This is usually where my feelings get hurt, because the provincial recommendations, it's only one farmer out of 100 that actually try to use those, but that we're working on that and trying to improve some of our guidelines. So hopefully it might be useful to more than one person. And the next slide. Okay. Well, my animations are not working today, but that's going to free us up some time.
Hey, John.
Yep.
Just go down and try clicking the slideshow icon one more time. Right there. Is that not working for you?
It is on my screen, but not on the one that's being
Showing up.
showed up for view.
Okay.
That's okay. I can live without it. I'll just tell you what you're supposed to know.
Okay.
Just that our interim guidelines, thank goodness the former guidelines are hid because they're a little embarrassing. They were extrapolations from studies done in the late 80s. And so the yellow bars are hidden there, and the green ones are our interim guidelines, which is research that I kind of did guerrilla type until the university got properly funded to do some. And I found that under medium yielding sites, it was taking about 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, like the old guidelines. But in our higher yielding sites, we were getting optimum economic yields with less than that, about 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel. That's pretty easy math for the people on the line here to figure out what those rates would be, less the soil nitrate level. So I say that was our interim guidelines up until I think a week ago. And then Don Flayton at the university has had a student beavering away on this and has done 17 site years over the last 2 years. Finally had a peek at his data, which he was supposed to present at the AgVise meetings on Tuesday. And based on their recent findings, it looks like my guidelines might be too conservative. At his 17 sites, he was finding a greater nitrogen requirement as far as fertilizer requirement was demanded. I'm thinking that's because it was dry years. But he did note when he separated his data that sites are still more nitrogen in his lower yielding sites. So when I look at that and say, okay, why is it that my site years were more nitrogen efficient, or I needed less nitrogen fertilizer? I think it's the mineralization thing. Lanny estimated that in the dry years, the mineralization averaged 53 pounds of nitrogen to the acre. And in the years I did my studies in 2016, 2017, I was getting about 100 pounds more under moist and warm conditions we had those years than what Lanny was indicating. And so that is telling me, once I click this on, that's telling me that we're just that mineralization is the answer to this thing, but it's still really unpredictable. So we've got to work over this, and I'll invite Greg to attend some of our committee meetings when we look to roll these new 17 years into our data set and our recommendations. I put a slide in here just showing what happened this last year. We have some really low residual nitrate levels following corn compared to every other year. This is data from AgVise labs. And I'm looking at that for two reasons that it's low. One is I think we just had a lot less mineralization this year. So we didn't have the large carryover we often observe. And the other thing is, we had a lot of rainfall in the fall, and agronomists I've talked to have said that in some of these soils, particularly where we grow corn, there was probably quite a bit of leaching during the month of October when we were so wet. And so a couple of reasons for those very low nitrate levels following corn this year, really out of the ordinary.
And when are those measured, John?
Those are 2-foot samples taken following the crop harvest, generally.
Okay.
Yeah. What we like to see, this is, a target which would be show us that, we're fairly efficient with our nitrogen. If we have carryover between 20 to 40 pounds of nitrate in, means we did a pretty good job of hitting the mark with nitrogen supply and yield potential. Usually with corn, it's higher. Sometimes those are manured fields, but sometimes I think it's just a case of fertilizing for higher than the yield potential, and we're not able to account for the huge mineralization that we see some years when we grow corn. So that's my story. Next slide is again the Stratus group that did the survey of 100 corn growers in Manitoba. We're looking at various placements and of nitrogen, and I've just compared a slide here comparing Manitoba versus the Eastern Canadian corn growers, and we can see the top set there that we apply 25% of our nitrogen goes down in the fall as a band. And if I was to speculate where that's taken place, that's taken place on our clay soils. It's very commonly done there. And we look at, we have quite a bit of nitrogen that goes down in the spring before planting. Most that's broadcast and incorporated. And then we have nitrogen going down at seeding that kind of mirrors the pattern that they have in Eastern Canada. But the big difference is in the after seeding applications. Manitoba growers are just kind of timidly tinkering with that, in contrast to in Ontario, where it is showing like over 25% are doing some type of side dressing, and others are doing, even the writing's a little small for me on that, but much more engaged in doing in-season nitrogen application. So, but Manitoba growers are curious about this, so we have had research programs looking at this. What do our wide drop tests tell us, where we've been evaluating this in some of my studies, the 10 studies I was working with? We found that many times at 4 of my sites, there's not really much response to nitrogen because of the mineralization we had. And where there was response to nitrogen, we found that the in-season wide drops applications were producing similar yields as at seeding nitrogen. In the text there underneath, I've talked about the recent studies. So looking at a number of in-season applications, there was no difference at 15 of 17 sites. At one site, there was less yield when the wide drop was delayed until the V9 stage. And at one of the other sites, the greatest yield just happened to be with Super U applied at seeding. So there are some cases where some placements will work better or worse, but most of the time they were the same. And if we look at what the Manitoba corn growers have been doing, they've been doing some 21 on-farm tests looking over the last 3 years, looking at base rate versus withholding 40 pounds of that and then coming back and putting the 40 pounds on later. So this is a piano graph. And so the zero horizontal bar there, 0 would be the rate that the pre or the at seeding nitrogen was providing, and deviation from that is either less or more. And of those 21 sites, there were only differences, significant differences 3 times. Significant reduction in yield once, that red bar coming down on the left side, and that was due to, again, a late application, I believe, again, close to the after V8 stage. I thought it was V9 stage, and it was dribble, so it was not placing the nitrogen below the canopy and on the ground. Maybe not much surprise there. And then there were 2 cases where there were yield increases, and both of those were with the wide drop UAN. I look at this as being good news. If there is no differences between splitting and having your nitrogen in place in advance, this is great news for this year when we missed the opportunity to put on full nitrogen. So this indicates that farmers can go with some spring applied nitrogen and then follow up with the remainder in season with little risk of jeopardizing yield. Again, we don't see much upside potential, but we don't see a penalty either. So I see that as good news. Oh, just a couple slides here. Those same survey study looked at other questions, and we look at corn growers. 21% of the Manitoba growers said they're using some type of variable rate, in contrast with 9% of Eastern Canadian growers. And the next slide is looking at what about enhanced efficiency fertilizers used on 12% of the Manitoba farmers, and double that in Eastern Canada. No surprise to me, they're living in a humid environment. That's where nitrogen losses are higher, and so they should be using those products more routinely. If we move on to phosphorus, I've highlighted the one contrast there. Well, there's a couple contrasts. One is that we do apply more phosphorus in the fall. I'm glad to see that a good portion of that is banded, presumably with the nitrogen. But the red bar there looks at what about soil banded nitrogen or phosphorus at seeding. We can see that the Easterners are leading us in that. 14% of our farmers are putting on some sort of phosphorus side banding. And I've just, the next slide here just shows, I'll go back to it, just shows how many of our farmers are doing this. Every year I get to add 2 or 3 farms to my photo gallery of how you simply do some plumbing, buy some 2x2 banding attachments for your naked planter, and pull an old air cart, and you simply put your P&K where it is supposed to be, 2 inches to the side and 2 inches below. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because people are tired of hearing it from me. Other than the bottom right-hand picture there is of a strip till unit, and we do see more each year. There's a few more strip till farms coming on stream here, and of course they've got the ability to put that P&K right in the strip where the crop will be establishing. Next slide is a summary of the phosphorus use in Manitoba. And if there's fertilizer dealers on the line, they can kind of beat their chests a little bit. The last 2 years, there's been an increase in phosphorus applied over and above what the crop has been removing. And some of that we're looking at, well, the message is getting out to farmers that they need to replenish some of those depleted soils, because previous to that, we'd have about 5 of the last 7 years where we had been mining the soil. So I gather people are maybe doing penance the last couple years, and part of that is we've had some dry years and maybe some less yield. So how are we doing this? How are farmers rebuilding some of these soils? We have a formula for that. It's not our brainchild. It's one that's in the Ontario Fertility Guide. It's one that's used in Kansas and most US states. We've just tinkered it with some prairie values. If we're looking at an example here for a wheat crop, you could put corn in there if you do the alterations, but we look first at, what is a good range to move our phosphorus levels into? We consider that range to be 10 to 20 parts per million. So if we set a target at 15 and we're currently at 5, that's in the blue. Our buffering capacity or soil characteristics, there has been research, and we do know what those values are for neutral pH sandy loam soils that can take 16 to 20 pounds of P2O5 to raise the soil test by 1 part per million. Contrast that with our calcareous clay loam soils, where it takes double those rates of phosphorus in order to move the soil test value. So growers can tailor that for their situation. They can also tailor what's in the red. That's their crop removal, which is the yield multiplied by the P concentration in the green. And then the one that really provides flexibility is, well, how many years do you want to take to do this? Are you impatient and want to do it in 5, or are you more patient or want to do it in 10. And so the flexibility that's built into here can accommodate fertilizer prices, crop values, and the person's economic situation. We know that not all fields need to be fixed, but most farmers have a fixer-upper field or not, which are testing under 10 parts per million. And so here's our strategy or our option that we're promoting and crusading with this past year. Oh, I should mention our current recommendations are still on the books, but those are based on the sufficiency approach. It's very good for short-term economics, will provide good yields, maybe not top yields, but good economic yields, but they will often occur at the expense of soil test values. And with our current yields, they tend to lead to depletion. So that has been the driver in developing this option for growers. Next, the potassium, another AgVise slide of those soils with testing below 200 parts per million. Why 200 parts per million? Well, that's where we say the sufficiency level or the critical level is for potassium. So we can see that there are quite a number of fields, even in the clay areas, where we do have soils testing below that level. Our recommendation slide is here, so you can see even at 100 parts per million, which is the critical level for a lot of our other crops, we still have some pretty healthy potash recommendations for corn. And note that if you're broadcasting and incorporating, you need to apply double the amount to get the response you would in that sacred 2x2 band, and hence the preaching. So, and in fact, this past year, got some pictures and been out on calls where the broadcast application just did not work very well at modest rates. We had cold, dry soils this past spring, and broadcast K was just not accessible to the young plant when they needed it. I'm sure the people, I've seen some of the names on the line and they don't need me to show them pictures of what K deficiency looks like. They know that it's firing on the outside of the bottom leaves. Just a couple pictures here of the variability that we see within fields. We can see some tremendous variability or patterns showing up. These are complements of amber eggs in the McGregor area. And so, but bottom line, severe deficiencies like this need to be fixed with some high rates and some properly placed rates of potash. Moving on to zinc, again, an AgVise summary showing those portion of fields testing below 1 part per million. 1 part per million, that's also our critical level for zinc for corn. And so we can see that, you know, 25 to 30% of fields in some of the corn growing area are short. If I look at this next slide, the survey of Manitoba corn growers, message to me is that a lot of people must be ignoring zinc in their fertility program. If only, you know, we have 40% of the fields testing under 1, but only 5% of the growers applying zinc. That's a bit of a wake-up call for me. The next slide is showing some of the zinc deficiencies that we see showing up in fields with that whitening or striping near the rule of the plant. It can be quite common whenever we get cool, wet conditions in the spring. And it's worse too when we follow canola in the rotation. Mycorrhizae, besides helping take up phosphorus, also helps take up zinc. So it tends to be worse in fields following canola. This is the data that we are living with. Some of this you can see goes back to the 80s, but when those sites were soil tested less than 1 part per million, we were getting some pretty healthy yield increases with the application of zinc fertilizer. Once it's over 1 part per million, only 1 in 4 cases was there a yield advantage to zinc application. So we're pretty comfortable living with that 1 part per million DTPA extractant as our critical level. And again, some AgVise data showing that we can tinker with zinc or we can fix zinc. Our zinc recommendation in the book talks about a broadcast incorporated application, and people ask, well, how long might that last? We can see here's a demonstration they're following. 10 years out, we still have elevated zinc levels with that application. But there's a number of products out there now that do have zinc or allow zinc application with starter fertilizer that should be able to meet the needs of the crop. Just a fast wrap on sulfur, that corn does need sulfur, but it don't need much. The studies we did of uptake, we found that about 11 pounds per acre was all that a 146 bushel crop took up in Manitoba, but it does need sulfur. We can see, and we are seeing increasing numbers of this pale looking corn. And we do worry. I put the soil test and tissue, or put the tissue test on here. We do encourage tissue testing because to put nitrogen on a sulfur deficient corn crop could actually make the severity worse. So we want it properly diagnosed. Kind of leaning on Minnesota guidelines because they've been doing quite a bit of work with it. And we have people here in Manitoba thinking they're in Minnesota, they're in a corn soybean rotation. Canola was good because canola, people spend the money on putting sulfur on it, but as canola exits the rotation, sometimes sulfur is exiting the rotation, and we need to be diligent about that. Minnesota refers more to, they say their responses are on low organic matter, sandy soils. They don't see the sulfur soil test as very predictable, and their suggestion is, 10 pounds of sulfur per acre. Source and timing, not critical. I think some recent work by Dan Kaiser is saying that, the elementals need to be on well in advance, because unless the sulfate form is available in the month of June and July, it's not going to meet the needs of the crop. And so my summary, nitrogen rates, well, they're under review, and like everyone else, mineralization is our dark horse. It can provide us a lot or a little, and that makes it pretty hard to make in advance recommendations, but we will figure out a way to do that. Nitrogen split applications, I'm thinking that's a good option for people in 2020, so they can come back and maybe put the bulk or a good portion of the rate on after seeding, as long as it's done by the V6 stage. I'm still very hip on side banding or phosphorus, and there's lots of people that are doing that. We now have guidelines for your long-term sustainability phosphorus fertilization rates. Potassium is needed, and if you're putting it on, particularly if you're in low testing soils, banded is most efficient. I don't know why we're so timid about the zinc. I think corn growers just need to get more aggressive in getting that into the program. And with sulfur, when we drop canola from the rotation, and often sulfur goes with it, we need to be more diligent with our corn fertility program. So I'm going to wrap it up there, guys. If you have any questions coming through, I'd be happy to hear them.
Any questions for John?
Hey, so John, do you rank sulfur or zinc as your biggest concern, or between the two of them? Where do you think there's more yield lost in Manitoba cornfields? If not that you should necessarily pick one over the other, but I'm going to ask you to pick your priority.
Well, I'm more shocked about the zinc, because I figured that most ag retailers had growers, like when a number came back that only 5% of those 100 Manitoba growers were using zinc. That shocked me. I thought it was a bigger portion of the program than that. The sulfur, we often see sulfur deficiencies, but they're usually temporary in corn. When we get farmers to address them, and I ask for what was the yield difference, they say, oh, it grew out of it. Well,
Yeah.
and for sulfur, it truly does grow out of it. Once the roots get a little deeper in the profile, they generally pick it up. But in a short growing season like what we have, I really don't like to see the corn crop sitting still and suffering for anything. But I'm thinking that zinc might be more of an issue than our sulfur would.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other questions for John? All right, with that, we will turn it over to John Fox. John, I'm going to make you the presenter here.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for having me, guys. I appreciate the opportunity. I'd like to thank Greg and Jarret from MAIZEX for asking me to come here and do a little bit of presentation. Of course, this was going to be in person, but given the current state of the world, this is certainly something that we can facilitate. I'd also like to thank John Heard for his presentation, a wealth of knowledge, that man, so we could all stand to listen to him. Thanks, everybody. Looks like a couple of dozen people that have joined us this morning, and I've only got a limited amount of time. I had about an hour's worth of presentation and slides that I was going to go through, but I'll try and skinny that down for everybody here. So with that, we'll just get right into it. Today's presentation, we're going to cover a lot of the key areas, the frequent flyers, the problem areas that we see on the planters over and over again as you know, we visit with farmers and we discuss with them the key issues that they face annually with keeping their planters up to snuff. Oftentimes we deploy technology. Precision planting, of course, has a lot of technology available to improve you know, our emergence and our profitability and our yield on the farm. You know, as Greg commented earlier on, the first dollar spent should be on even emergence, and with that strive for even emergence, really it comes back down to the planter itself. You could add any number of our technologies onto the planter. You know, Delta Force for consistent downforce management and improved metering with VSET for singulation. But ultimately, there's a lot of things that exist on the row unit and on the planter that can impact that before we ever get to successfully use those pieces of technology. So as we advance through the slides here, you know, we're going to talk a lot about corn. That's where our focus is going to be. But really these apply to all crops that we're planting these days, whether it be sunflowers or edible beans, soybeans. You know, but really when we talk about it, we come back to corn. Corn is where precision planting has logged, you know, cataloged 3 million plants. Literally, there's been engineers and students and agronomists with devices out there measuring plant stand and assessing, on trying to understand the yield and what a mistake cost them here and what a mistake cost them there. And so, you know, we're going to touch briefly on ear potential. We're going to talk about a few things here that are going to hold us back a little bit, a few ways that we start losing potential, right? When we talk about the ear potential, we're talking about how much cob that plant can produce, how much of an ear that plant can produce. And when we start talking about things like spacing, when we talk about, you know, minor misplaced, we're talking about 1/10 of an ear loss. When we're talking about major misplaced ears, plants rather, we're talking about 2/10. You know, we're crowding our neighbors. We're starting to pull back on our yield potential. When we start talking about skips and doubles, we start talking about 4/10 of an ear or 8/10 of an ear in the case of a skip. And why is it only 8/10 of an ear? Well, some of these varieties these days are really good at flexing and overcoming some of that, you know, missed opportunity that was there. When we start talking about a late emerger, which goes back to what Greg was commenting on, when we see something that's 1 leaf collar behind something that came out, you know, a day or two behind its neighbor, we start to talk about, you know, a 1/2 an ear of lost potential there. When we start talking about, you know, 2 leaf collars behind, we start talking about basically a weed, something that something that's really not going to produce any sort of yield whatsoever. The good news regarding this stuff is a lot of this stuff is maintenance and setup. The spacing errors that we're talking about, the singulation errors that we're talking about, these are all setup issues. These are things that we can address and identify prior to the season. So, you know, that's certainly something that we can look at, and using the technology, whether it's the Meter Max test stand or any of the other number of tools that we have at our disposal. These are things that we can address. It's adjusting nuts and bolts. When we start talking about late emerging crops, we start talking about management issues. We start talking about the various different practices that we implement that try and help us with getting these plants out of the ground in an even manner. The best part about today's presentation, my job, is being able to talk to you, you know, to walk to your farm, to adjust nuts and bolts on that planter and improve what you're already doing. Anytime I can adjust a nut and bolt and improve that potential, that's an awesome day. The opportunity we have to control, I can help you with. You know, I can't help you with weather, I can't help you with soils, your fertility, but if it's those nuts and bolts, that's all in our control. So as we talk about, you know, spacing errors, there's certain things that have been just drilled into our heads regarding what's causing those things. And ultimately, for years, we've been discussing speed. Speed kills a planter, right? Well, why is that? Well, a lot of the time it's due to row unit ride. It's how much that row unit is moving around in the field. Sometimes that's due to our field conditions. Obviously, coming out of a fall like we had in 2019, we're faced with some real challenges regarding residue management. So whether that's guys going out with vertical tills and trying to work that ground, you know, we could end up with a lumpy surface if the conditions aren't right. But what we see is we see row unit bounce, we see chatter, excuse me, and when those row units start to bounce, that affects the metering accuracy. We start to see changes in depth, changes in the closing wheel, the ability to close, and the road cleaners. So that's why the whole industry has told us to slow down. And then we came out with speed tube, and we said speed up, right? But the whole thing with planting fast is we can't have a yield drag that goes along with it. So we have to be careful. We have to manage those things accordingly. Next, you know, we're going to talk about metering, delivering that one seed at a time, every single time. And again, that comes back to setup and adjustment. Whether you're running a John Deere Pro Max 40, an E-set or a V-set, or a celled original disc for your corn, getting it on a stand and you know, testing it, making sure that we're getting that one seed every single time. That's what we're looking for. And then when we come back to emergence, right, we're looking at management choices surrounding emergence. We really need three things. We need a little bit of moisture, we need a little bit of temperature, and we need a little bit of oxygen to kick off that plant's growth cycle. And so this is all about monitoring and understanding ground conditions as we are planting, understanding what's going on as we're putting those seeds in the ground. So we've got 4 areas of focus here. Sorry, I'm just moving some stuff around on my screen. We're going to talk about furrow creation, placing a seed, furrow destruction, and monitoring that furrow. All planters, despite the marketing claims, they all have the same exact job to do. They open up a ditch, dump a seed, cover it up, and move on. There are some nuances within that, though. Obviously, you know, with the John Deere world, we're firming the sidewalls, we're creating a furrow, but it's doing it in a totally different way than, say, let's say a Case IH early riser, where they're not actually firming that sidewall. That reduced inner diameter on that wheel is creating that mellow environment. So there are some nuances between them, you know, but we want to try and understand, how do I create that furrow? How do I place a seed correctly? And how do I destroy that furrow like I was never even there? So let's talk about, first of all, our furrow creation. You know, I want to watch, first of all, the bar that the row units are connected to. That toolbar you can see on the bottom left-hand illustration there. We've got a toolbar that's dipped forward, it's nose down. And in some other examples, right, we can see where that row unit's planting uphill. And in each of those examples, that those row units aren't planting, aren't running through the field the way that they were designed. They were designed to be flat. So, you know, the first thing we're going to want to do, whatever that looks like for the setup that you have, we're going to want to make sure that in the field, in field position, traveling through the field, that we've got that row unit, that toolbar completely flat to the ground. This needs to be done in field and in motion. We also want to make sure that we have, you know, a sufficient amount of ballast. That bar needs to have enough weight to keep those opener discs and gauge wheels contacting the ground. In lots of examples, you know, in older planters, since markers have become sort of obsolete, we've got guidance, of course, in RTK. Guys have removed those markers where they would have added, you know, a significant amount of ballast to that toolbar. And, you know, let's use as an example, we've got a 4-row planter, and each of those rows requires 200 pounds of downforce to get to our seeding depth that we're asking for, whether that's 2 inches or 3 inches in some of the studies that Greg's doing. You know, we need 800 pounds of ballast. We need to make sure that that toolbar weighs at least that, so that those discs penetrate to that depth. If we don't have that, all we're going to do is we're going to start lifting up that toolbar, and we're not going to achieve depth. We're going to shallow up, and that's going to cause us to have that uneven germination that we're looking for. So whether we're adding, you know, if we're removing the markers, we want to make sure that we're adding some sort of weight, some sort of ballasting back onto that toolbar to keep it into the ground. You can see here in this illustration in the upper right-hand corner, we've got a bigger toolbar, 80-foot toolbar, I believe it is. And when this particular planter hit the field, those outer wings, they had installed delta force on the planter, and those outer wings started to push up out of the ground. So we ended up looking like a bird flying through the field. And so they came out, you can see that payloader on the left with that pallet of suitcase weights, and added that weight to the outside wings to make sure that those outer rows had enough force on them so that the delta force system could do its job, make sure that we're getting to depth, to that 2-inch depth, whatever our target is. You can see the same thing on the bottom left with that harvest toolbar. That guy's ballasted up for the same reason. Ultimately, we're talking about Newton's law here, right? For every action, there's an equal and an opposite reaction. So as hard as those row units are pushing up, we got to have something that they can push against. So once we've got the toolbar leveled out, and once we've got it ballasted correctly, now we have to attach a row unit to it. You know, really, that toolbar is nothing more than a towing vessel. It is attached to parallel arms, and any rocking or motion or slop in those mounting bushings is going to change and affect our seeding depth and our delivery. I think I've got a video loaded up here where we can have a little bit of a look of an example of perhaps what a row unit with a little bit of slop and a little bit of wear, like a lot of them out there, look like. And so we look at those row units, and you can see that tail section, it's moving up and down, and we want to limit the amount of movement to anything under ½ an inch. I know a 12-row planter, and we thought we had it in pretty good shape, but when we started to apply some of these principles and really investigate what we saw on that planter, we saw those same sort of concerns. And so we've worked hard now to address those. You know, there's all sorts of repair options that exist. The OEMs, of course, have their replacement parts, but the aftermarket is coming big time and offered us improvements to those parallel arms where we can replace them with a wear bushing, where those parallel arms no longer wear. So, you know, that's a consideration. We want to make sure that we stop any of that movement, any of that side-to-side play, any of that vertical movement that we see at all. We want to eliminate that entirely. So now we've got our parallel arms, we've got all the slop removed. Now we're moving over to disc openers. How big should a new disc opener be? Well, I guess that depends on what brand of planter we're talking about, but in the John Deere world, 15 inches are desired new diameter on discs. And so you can see here how much wear should they have before being replaced. In our world, a ½ inch generally. Anything below 14.5 inches, we're going to want to replace that disc. And when we're replacing that disc, we want to make sure that we set it up in a jig on a vise, and we check it for its runout and its deflection and its consistency. And you know, there's no manufacturer, there's no one manufacturer of these discs that is prone to having an issue, but we've certainly seen having to go through 60 or 80 blades to get, you know, a couple of dozen that are consistent, where we can rely on them to meet the specifications that we require, so that we can achieve our desired planting depth consistently and not run into any sort of issues. So you can see here we've got a screwdriver checking runout where the hub placement in the center of that disc is true, and also the deflection in and out as we're spinning those around. And I see here I'm about 20 minutes in, so I'll try and pick this up. We've also got our seed tube guards there, right? We want to make sure that we've got a good width there, that when we start creating that furrow, pressing that seed disc into the ground, that it's not deflecting in and becoming too narrow, so that we create a tight V. We want to see, you know, a reasonably wide bottom in that furrow, so that seed can sit right down inside of it. You can see there a little bit of a picture of one that's quite worn. So now as we apply pressure to those discs, they're going to want to squeeze in, and we're going to narrow up the bottom of that seed trench. Here you can see an example of that, one where on the left we've got, you know, an okay seed trench, and on the right we've got one that's narrowed up and it's nice and tight. And here, you know, and I didn't touch on that a moment ago, but when we're shimming those seed discs up, we want to have the appropriate amount of contact point. With the Case IH discs, they don't actually want any contact point. They want a 1 or 2 business card thickness between those discs. They have a leading edge disc, but when we talk about the John Deere True V openers, on the older planters, we've got a 3mm disc, so we're talking a couple inches of contact. If we're talking a newer John Deere or the 3.5mm blade, we're 1.5 inches. If we have too much tension, we can run into bearing failures. You can see here this housing is cracked. We want to avoid that. That's going to cost you downtime, time in the field that's wasted. Here we can see a few examples of some of the common wear points. In the bottom left, we've got a W trench, so our shimming on those True V discs isn't what we'd like to see. We've got that little bit of a raised area there. We've got on the right hand side, we illustrate, you know, what the proper shimming technique looks for those John Deere True V openers, using a couple of simple business cards and just sliding them together and measuring that distance. Now we're going to move on to gauge wheels, and we want to make sure that we've got, you know, good gauge wheel contact to our True V openers. It's not likely to be a concern this spring with dry conditions like in the last few years. We may see more muddy conditions like you can see in that upper left-hand corner, where if we don't have that tension tight enough to that seed disc at our planting depth, now we've got mud being introduced into that gauge wheel, and we could end up, you know, jamming the whole works up and dragging instead of rolling through the soil. And you can see on the right-hand side there, we can actually fit our fingers in. That's far too much distance, far too much wear in that example. So, you know, that's one of the things that we want to be mindful of, that we've got that good sharp edge on that gauge wheel, and we've got it tied up against that True V opening disc. I think I've got a video here. Yeah, so here's an example of one where it's not shimmed correctly. You know, so we're working very hard to get to our 2-inch planting depth where we know the moisture line is, and we can see where that gauge wheel's throwing that rooster tail up. Now we've got a gauge wheel that's shimmed correctly, and we're not throwing that dry soil into that furrow. Once we drop that dry soil into that furrow where we worked so hard to get to that moisture, now we're going to start wicking that moisture away. We're going to end up affecting our emergence timing again. So from the gauge wheel itself, we're going to talk about the gauge wheel arm. We can see here there's a couple of examples of a few different types of planters. On the left is your traditional John Deere gauge wheel arm. We can see obviously some wear indicated there in the green circle. Where there's a dimple, there's a wear spot. The mustache in the upper right hand corner, again, that's its contact point. And as those wear, we see a lot of inconsistencies from row to row. On the right-hand side there, I believe that's a Kinsey row unit, and so it contacts that gauge wheel arm in a different position, but it's the same wear concern. You can see the new one on the left and the worn one out on the right. Those are things, those gauge wheel arms, depending on the age of the planter and what sort of maintenance has been done in the past, they can actually be swapped from left to right. So if you've got the opposite side of that, kind of where that arrow is located, you can actually swap that arm from left to right. But we want to make sure that if we are swapping it from left to right, we're doing it consistently across all the rows of the planter. We don't want to be mixing and matching. We don't want to have some with the wear spot and some without, because now we're to a point where we have no idea where we're consistent. So if we're going to replace them all, if we're going to flip them all, whatever we do, we want to make sure that we're consistent across the width of that toolbar. Here's a really interesting test that everybody can do. It doesn't take much time, and it's certainly very effective. It's called our block test, and we would certainly recommend that for an annual part of our inspection. You can take that 2x4 and that 1/2 inch piece of plywood simulating our 2-inch planting depth and just run that system across your toolbar and see how much variation you have from row to row. I know last year we performed that test on our planter and we found up to a 1/2 inch, 5/8 of difference from row to row because of those wear points that we've been talking about. So, on the John Deere planters, we simply adjust that positioning of that T handle to counteract that variation from row to row. But at least then we have an idea of where our true 2-inch depth is. Otherwise, we may have rows that are planting at 1.5 inches. I think our next slide here is just showing, another technique using 4x4s with a stack of washers. Whatever the technique is, it doesn't matter. We just want to make sure that we're consistent across the toolbar, that we're doing the same thing on every row, so that we're achieving that correct planting depth row to row. I think this next picture, it illustrates an example of a smaller plot planter where they did that measurement, and you can see on the left the measurement difference that they found and how that correlated to what they saw in the field. You can see there that those 2 center rows are that number 1 row, and that they didn't achieve depth like they had intended, and that consequently affected their germination. They've got sporadic germination compared to the neighboring rows, which were achieving depth like they had intended. Seed placement. So now we've got our bar leveled, we've got our parallel arms in order, we've got our True V discs all worked out, our gauge wheel arms, our block test done. We think we're pretty good. We're in a pretty good spot. But now we got to look at our meters, and here we can see some really extreme examples of some John Deere finger meters and on the left, and a John Deere vacuum meter on the right, where some critters have gotten in there. Obviously, there's been a little bit of neglect, and things just don't look as good. I don't think those things are going to meter anything. So we want to make sure that we're doing some annual inspections, looking at things like door seals and singulators if we're running an E-set or a V-set. We would typically use our Meter Max test stand, and customers would bring us their meters, and we would place them on our stand and test them in a stationary position to make sure that we've got the appropriate vacuum for their seed selection. With some of the other systems out there, there are a lot of settings that can be tweaked and adjusted, and it's nice to know that we've got things in order prior to hitting the field. Typically with this presentation, we do a demonstration showing what effect something as simple as a change in vacuum can do to our seeds as far as our singulation and our metering ability. And so I don't obviously have that ability, but I've got a little bit of a video here. Hopefully it plays for us. It's just a slow-mo video. We typically use Tic Tacs and M&Ms and various candies, but in this example, we're using pinto beans, black beans, some bin run corn, some treated corn, just a hodgepodge of stuff. And these are the sort of things that we try and do in the shop prior to hitting the field, so that we can make sure that those meters are up to snuff and operating 100%. So again, let's make sure that we're looking at those things. And I see that I'm pretty well at the end of my time allotment here, so I'll try and not rush through it too quickly, but cover the last few points here. Obviously, we can see some examples of some row unit drive chains. That one in the middle was an example from a dealer lot that was supposedly field ready. Probably the two worst words in in a farmer's mind. Does that look field ready to any of you? You know, we can see in the bottom left that chain is rusty, and every time that chain moves around that sprocket, it's going to create a jarring effect, which could potentially drop seeds off our metering plates and affect our singulation, something we strive so hard for. Our meter we tested on the stand was great, but when we got it into the field, into practice, that row unit maintenance really caused it to fail. So there's another example of something that we can quite easily look at, and probably a lot of you do. So let's make sure that we're looking at all aspects of that. Seed tube wear, we can see when we talk back about that seed tube guard, if it's narrowed up too much, we've got those discs wearing on that guard, and that can, once again, as that seed's traveling down that seed tube, we can see that seed ricocheting out the bottom of the seed tube into the furrow, and all of a sudden now we've got a placement issue. Everything before it was okay, but the seed tube has caused the problem. Here's an example of that narrow trench where that corn kernel is hanging up in the seed trench. We can actually see a number 2 pencil underneath it. We've worked hard to get to 2 inches. We're not there. If we close that furrow, that seed's shallow. It's not germinating like it should. Furrow destruction. So here, you know, we're trying to focus on alignment and integrity. We want to make sure that our closing wheels are lined over our seed trench. There's a simple example at the top where we lower that planter down and drag it forward a few feet, and we can check that alignment quite easily. And of course, there's all sorts of adjustments available in that closing wheel assembly to make sure that we're centered over top of that furrow so that we're closing it evenly. Excuse me. On the right-hand side, we can see the closing wheel assembly where that bushing exists. That quite often gets slopped out. That cast gets really wore, and now all of a sudden we've got an opportunity for movement with that tail section, and we just can't close that furrow the way we intended. You can see on the left-hand side what happens on those Case IH examples. The same sort of thing there. And once again, you know, the John Deere assembly, there are companies and components that exist to upgrade those as opposed to just replacing them with the same parts that'll be prone to failure. So something to be mindful of. Here we can see an example of a closing wheel that's completely split. The rubbers come off of the plastic, and we've got dirt built in there. Obviously, we're not going to be closing that the way we anticipated. Here we see a few examples of the spacing, which is really important. This is one of the things that often gets overlooked as well. Depending on our seeding depth, we want to make sure that the spacing on those closing wheels is representative of our typical closing depth, or pardon me, of our seeding depth. So if we're attempting to hit 2 inches, we want to make sure that the spacing on those closing wheels is 2 inches as well. And if we shallow up, let's narrow that spacing up. If we're too narrow like the one on the left, you know, we're closing everything on top, but we're leaving an air slot. And if we got an air slot, we're potentially going to dry out and again affect that emergence. The one in the center is pretty well perfect at our desired 2-inch depth, and the one on the right is too wide. Now we're closing the bottom, but we're leaving the top of the furrow completely open. I'm not going to talk a lot about checking the pressures of our closing wheel assemblies, but this is something that is, again, a good practice, because just because it says it's the number 1 notch on one row doesn't mean it's the same pressure on the next. Here was a study that talked about, you know, having the right pressure or the right selection, the right notch on our closing wheels, and what the effects was to yield. Again, I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I'm basically out of time. And then furrow monitoring. You know, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. I don't know if anybody's actually spent any time in the back of a planter. Greg, maybe you doing this. It's probably not safe, probably not ideal. That's one of the precision engineers, you know, hanging out at the back, trying to see what's going on. Here's something quick to think about. You know, when we talk about costs and expense, you know, we've got labor rates that are typical ag shop. We've got, you know, lawyers that have their rates. You know, we could be talking $100 an hour. You know, what are we spending based on these parameters that we've shown here? You know, we're spending 86 cents every second. We're spending, let's see, a farmhand here. We're talking about it, service calls, accountants, $3,000 an hour. Seeding, that's your cost for your seed, putting it in the ground. So let's make sure that we get it right. We're talking about monitoring. This was the old go and no go. We had lights telling us we were seeding, and that was great for the time, but we've certainly come a long way since. There's also some opportunity there, whether it's, you know, our 2020s with these screens showing us all these different metrics, the population, singulation, spacing, row unit ride, gauge wheel weight, furrow moisture, and on and on. There's a lot of technology that exists that's really going to help us to drive that decision and make sure that what's happening in the furrow is what we want, what we've worked so hard to get right. And so, you know, all those things that we talked about here earlier are all things that can take down a system, a planter that we've worked so hard to get right. And maybe we've put hydraulic downforce and improved metering capability and smart firmers on there, but ultimately, if the maintenance isn't in order, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot, just like this guy trying to pull that tree out. And so, you know, we've got all sorts of in conclusion, we've got all sorts of planter toolbars, whether it's White's or John Deere's, Case IH, Kinsey. They all require the same sort of thing. We want to make sure that our maintenance is in order and we've got it ready to rock for the spring. This year is going to be challenging. And so let's make sure with the few weeks we have remaining before we hit the field that we've got everything as good as we can make it before we get there. Lastly, you know, there are some reference materials and some good resources out there. The youtube.com precision planting website. A lot of the information I talked about is there. All their winter conference videos have been posted there now. There's a lot of fantastic information. Jason Webster, the commercial agronomist for precision, discusses a lot of things that he's doing at the PTI. We've obviously got a video series called Inside PTI that discusses a lot of these details and short videos that we can take on the go with us with our devices. And of course, visit your local precision planting dealer. We're a fantastic resource and we'll help you guys in every way possible to try and make sure that 2020 is the most successful season we can have. So with that, I know I've ran over by about 6 minutes here, Greg. Sorry for that. But it's a lot of information to cover and I wanted to make sure I tried to do it justice. So with that, thank you very much.
I think you started 6 minutes late, at any rate. So I think we're all happy for what you've covered. Thanks, John.
And I can't say enough how important that inspection is in the spring. I know I spend probably 2 days on my own planter in stripping down the rows and checking everything, especially, you know, your tubes and your tube protector underneath and discs. So I think it's the most valuable 2 days you spend all spring is going over that planter. So I appreciate all the comments and some excellent visuals as to what can happen, John. So greatly appreciated. Is there any questions for John? All right, we'll go to our final speaker now. Jarret Geisel. Jarret, I'm going to make you the presenter. Jarret's going to give us some tips on hybrids as we look at spring and some decisions as we're getting into planting. Jarret?
Hello, everyone. I just want to thank Greg and John for the presentation so far. Been really good and lots to learn from. So in mine here, I'm going to go look more into prescribing our varieties to the field. So really look at how where they may fit depending on the fields and conditions like that. So I'll move into it. Everyone there, it looks like it's coming on. So go with the right product for the right field. So get the best success for your hybrid. It can have a lot to do with the field conditions it's getting planted in. The details surrounding the field, whether it be a benefit or limit the hybrid. And right now is a great time for you to go through, either as farmer or as retailer, to see where these varieties that have been bought are going on the farm. So some of the details we'll look at come up through that may have effect on the variety. So the field details. So some of the factors there is the soil type. Varieties can do depending on how sandy you are, how clay there. That also comes into fact is the moisture availability. I know we've had a couple of dry years, but more on average year, do you get adequate moisture? It tend to be dry no matter what. And then soil fertility too. Are we high fertile ground or are we looking at low fertile ground? Next would be management type. So looking at the populations you're planting. Are you keeping things lower or are you wanting to push populations? Your fertility plan. Different hybrids will respond differently with amounts of nitrogen, etc. there. We're also, as we said, in some of the intensive management, we're looking at the responses to fungicide. So we're doing that right now and seeing how some of ours respond with it. And then a crop rotation can factor in there. What was your last crop? Is it corn on corn? And then harvest. So looking at where the field's going to fall in time frame of harvest. Is the the variety then be left out there longer? Is there a risk to be like some right now is still getting harvested now, or still some to go? And also in the silage is, if you're getting custom harvester, where do you fall in for when they're coming out? You might want to have something out there early, so when they call, they can come right out to do yours, or you might need to look at having a later option that can stay out for a while till they can make it. So now I'll get right into the varieties we have for option. So I'll start on the grain side and start with our newest early hybrid we just launched here this spring, MZ 1200. So it's a 72-day early double pro version, so it has a corn borer protection on it. So it is a fixed ear, so you want to push the populations on it. It has excellent sitting vigor, competitive against Pioneer 7202. So looking at on the early day, you want to make sure this is going to be on one of your first fields able to harvest. Most early ones, they tend to not probably stand as well as some of our later options with it. So then we'll go into our E44H12. So it's an early flowering hybrid, about 74-day, very solid stalk strength. So this one will stand. You will be able to leave it well, and it is more of a defensive hybrid. You saw in the some of the results that Greg had showed that it didn't quite respond as much to some of our intensive management. So lower seed rate. So tougher ground, you can use this one on. It'll handle all that well. Might not have the top end potential as the next hybrid I'll talk about, but for tougher ground and everything, this would be the one to go with. Then the showing again, just the population curve that Greg had shown too, is you can kind of very straight across, so not quite then respond as well if you're pushing the population. So then 1340, so 73, 74-day hybrid we have. So this is a higher yield potential. So you want to push populations on it as, you know, push the fertility to its high success rate, its early flowering. And then I showed on what Greg had showed there too, is it responded quite well to the intensive management, the higher nitrogen, the higher population, and the fungicide. There's just population curve there where you see a big increase as we go up with higher populations on it. So we next move into a 1624, 76-day hybrid. So it's a strong agronomic hybrid, so defensive. Some of the things we've seen too on it is it'll handle stresses. It's done well last couple years with a little drier year. There, it won't have that higher end potential if things go a little better. So a little on the tougher ground, stressful areas, this would be the one to go with. There, and then our companion hybrid, our 1688 that we have as the higher end yield potential. This stands quite well. Guys throughout this last year are quite happy with how it was doing and standing as things got later into harvest. Higher populations, good response in higher nitrogen population, and then fungicide and the intensive management program. Also excellent Gauss wilt tolerance on it. It also will hold up to stress decently. It's a little more of a constant hybrid for that, but there will be the 1624 will do a bit better on the stress there. So this will be for your better ground, better conditions. It will have your best bet there. And then you have population curve on it. You can see it increases as we go up there. So then I move into our E49K32, so our 79-day hybrid. It's really impressive late season plant health, responded well in the intensive management, higher populations, higher nitrogen in the fungicide, as early flower and fast grain set. So some of those other ones I've seen for a few years. This one I've seen last year, first time. It shows impressive results, so we'll see what else we can go forward and see how it does with some of our tests this next year's too. The population curve on it. Then last one for the grain I'll talk about is our E52V92. says high yield potential, excellent grain quality test weight, good Goss's Wilt, early flowering. So these dry years, it's still done okay, but I think when you get a little better year, this will have real good, nice potential for anyone looking for a later day option, wanting to push there. And I'll talk a bit about some of our silage hybrids now too. Our 7420, so the 7322 unit variety, very aggressive seeming vigor. It comes out of the ground quite quickly. It does well. It has a bit of a flex head, so overcome some of the lower populations and everything, but will do well when you increase populations. Can handle stresses well. It showed, say the stuff we had on my farm even had, it was pretty dry. We didn't have much rain at all, and this one stood out better than the other hybrids I did have in it. And then 7733, this is a double pro option. So when looking at corn on corn, plays factor there, a nice tall height, nice big ear on it, very good spring vigor, and stay green on it. This is a brand new this year hybrid. And then 8022, new this year also, if anyone's familiar with Dalton, but really good spring vigor, early season growth too, stands out, and handles drought stress quite well too. It fell right to the tip on the kernels, even with the lack of moisture we had this year in the plots. I've seen it. Very tall height to the fire, so very adequate and stressful areas. Then move up to our Avenza. I've been around quite a few years. Very impressive plant size, stays green, allows for flexible harvest on it. Rapid spring growth. Again, the early season, it stands out a lot. Early flowering, the white cob on it, so later day option for guys looking for that. And then E65G82, I'll be having in trials this year too. Heard good things out east on it for a late season option. Big, tall plants, flowers early and sets grain early, so it could be an option as it is a late day, but put starch on earlier to help with that side of things. And 9701, for anyone looking at the leafy flowery genetics, these you're looking lower populations. They don't like to be pushed at all there. They do take some time early on, but at the end they usually stand out there. But it's larger, more digestible starch. They're more leaves above the cob. Yeah, it's a good fit for anyone looking for big tonnage there. On it. That was basically most of the varieties there. We are with the Manitoba testing. We're getting a good look at all these varieties coming and new ones. We have a few new ones coming that we'll be looking at this year, a new 75-day for grain and a new 81-day for silage. We're continuing testing at these sites too with the Agronomy, with Greg, and seeing all these fit. I think we'll continue to expand what we're doing and see what else we can find out on these varieties to help position them at the right places for you guys, and making sure we're setting everything up to have the best success we can. If there are any questions, please let me know.
Any questions for Jarret? All right, hearing none, we'll just wrap up here then. Once again, we'd like to thank everybody for viewing this webinar, for listening to our feature speakers, which included Greg Stewart, John Heard, John Fox, and Jarret Geisel. Again, as we go into the spring of 2020, we ask everybody to be safe, follow the public health protocols, and if you need anything related to seed corn, in particular in Western Canada, please talk to your MAIZEX Seeds dealer. We've got product in place, and we have a team in place to support your needs as we look at the 2020 crop. Have a safe and productive growing season.